Chapter 4 There are three governments. There are thus three species of government: the republic, monarchy and despotism. These totalities should be closely examined. I. The Republic. I hope to be very brief on the Republic. Fouquet may have said that Montesquieu is a Republican. Montesquieu does not believe in the Republic, and for a simple reason: the age of republics is past. Republics only last in small states. Our era is that of medium and large empires. Republics can only be sustained by virtue and frugality, general mediocrity in its original sense, i.e. that everybody is content with nothing. Our age is one of luxury and commerce. Virtue has become such a burden that its effects would be disastrous if they could not be attenuated by milder laws. For all these reasons, the Republic retreats into the distant past, Greece, Rome. No doubt that is why it is so beautiful. Montesquieu, who is quite prepared to call Richelieu crazy for his claim to want an angel for king, so rare is virtue, accepts that in Greece and Rome there were, at certain periods, enough angels to make up whole cities. This political angelicism makes democracy, for here I shall ignore aristocracy, which is an unstable mixture of democracy and monarchy, an exceptional regime, a kind of synthesis of all the exigencies of politics. First, it is truly a political regime, by which I mean a regime which attains the true sphere of politics, that of stability and universality. In democracy, the men who are 62 everything are nonetheless not at the mercy of their own caprice. The citizens are not so many despots. Their omnipotence subordinates them to a political order and a political structure which they recognize and which transcend them as individual men. The order of the laws, whether fundamental, i.e. constitutive of the regime, or occasional, i.e. decreed in response to events. But this order itself, which makes them citizens, is not an order received from without, as for example is the feudal order, the natural inequality of the estates in a monarchy. In democracy, the citizens possess the unique privilege of themselves consciously and voluntarily producing in legislation the very order which governs them. Children of the laws, they are also their fathers. They are subjects only as sovereigns. They are masters subject to their own power. It is clear that this synthesis of subject and sovereign in the citizen, which haunted Rousseau, demands of man that he be more than man, and that without being quite an angel, he be a citizen, which is the true angel of public life. This category of the citizen realizes the synthesis of the state in man himself. The citizen is the state in the private man. That is why education has such an important place in the economy of this regime, for Montesquieu as well as for Rousseau. Montesquieu shows that democracy cannot tolerate the division of education characteristic of monarchic regimes. In fact, modern man is torn between two educations, that of his fathers and teachers on the one hand, and that of the world on the other. The one preaches him morality and religion. The other never to forget himself. And what Hegel was to call the law of the world, which governs real human relations, triumphs over the law of the heart, whose refuge is the hearth and the church. None of this in a democratic regime. Family, school and life speak the same language. the whole of life is simply an endless education. For, in its very essence, democracy presupposes, behind this endless discipline and edification which is in some sense its temporal form, a true conversion of the private man into the public man. If in democracy all private vices are public crimes, which is the justification for the censors, if civil law is identical with political Montesquieu, politics and history 63 law, that is because all of a man's private life consists of being a public man, the laws being the perpetual reminder of this exigency. This circle of democracy, which is simply the eternal education of democracy, this remarkable circle of a regime which thus accepts its existence as a perpetual task, realizes the specific duty of the citizens, who, in order to be all as they are in the state, must, in their very persons, become all of the state. A moral conversion? That is what Montesquieu proposes when he depicts virtue, although it is entirely political, as the preference of the public good over private good, as self-forgetfulness, as the triumph of reason over passion. But this moral conversion is not that of an isolated conscience, it is that of a state totally steeped in this duty, translated into laws. With its laws, the Republic, which wants citizens, takes care to force them into virtue. At what cost can this virtue be thus forced? At the cost of an archaic economy maintained in its past, at the cost of manners and morals carefully guarded by the laws, the aged and the censors, lastly, and above all, at the cost of judicious political measures, which only aim to edify the people in order to maintain it within the power of its notables. Indeed, what is striking in the entirely retrospective apologia for the people's government constituted by democracy, aristocracy is much less exemplary, because, dare I say it, it is founded from the outset on the division of the people, is the care taken to distinguish two peoples within the people. When Montesquieu's Republic is compared with Rousseau's, and the virtue of the one with the virtue of the other, it must not be forgotten that the former is in the past and the latter in the future, the latter a people's republic, the former a republic of notables. Hence the importance of the problem of popular representation. Rousseau has no intention that the people should legislate through its representatives. Sovereignty, for the same reason as makes it inalienable, cannot be represented. It lies essentially in the general will, and will does not admit of representation. 1 A democracy which adopts repri. Rousseau, The Social Contract, and Discourses, Op. Cit. p. 78. 64 Sensitives is on its deathbed. Montesquieu, on the contrary, holds that a democracy without representatives is an imminent popular despotism. This is because he has a very special idea of the people, confirmed by those ancient democracies in which the freedom of the freemen was to the forefront, leaving the multitude of artisans and slaves in the shade. Montesquieu does not want this common people, bas peuple, to have power. This is indeed his most deep-lying concern, and it illuminates all the precautions of Book 2. Abandoned to itself, the people, the common people, is nothing but passion. It is incapable of foresight, thought and judgment. How could passion judge, since it is the very absence of reason? Let the people therefore be deprived of all direct power, but let them choose representatives. They are extremely well qualified for choosing, for they see man in action at close quarters, and discern the good and the mediocre instantly. They know how to choose the good general, the good rich man and the good judge. They see the first in his wars, the second in his banquets and the third in his judgments. They have a natural capacity, in respect to the discernment of merit, and as proof that merit stares them in the face, though the people of Rome assumed to themselves the right of raising plebeians to public offices, yet they would never exert this power, and though, at Athens, the magistrates were allowed, by the law of Aristides, to be elected from all the different classes of inhabitants, there never was a case, said Xenophon, that the common people petitioned for employments which could endanger either their security or their glory. What a wonderful natural gift of the people, forcing them to admit their own inability even to be their own masters, and to take for lords precisely those who have the advantages of rank and fortune over them. Ancient democracy itself thus already witnesses in favor of all the notables of history. Thus in democracy there is available what is required to reign to the people. Roger 863. Force this judicious inclination and, if all else fails, what is required to admonish it and establish it in its vocation. In particular, there are laws which divide the people into classes, with enough discrimination to deprive the commoners of their votes. It is in the manner of making this division that great legislators have signalized themselves. Servius Tullius, for example, had the wit to lodge the right of suffrage in the hands of the principal citizens, so that it was property rather than numbers that decided the elections. Or the Roman legislators who realized that the public vote should be considered as a fundamental law of democracy, for the lower classes ought to be directed by those of higher rank, and restrained within bounds by the gravity of eminent personages. Voting secretly is a privilege of the aristocratic seigneury, for the reason that they are themselves their own great men. No doubt but that the surest means of maintaining such a natural disposition is to produce it. Carefully confined to the past by the enlargement of modern states and the turn of events which has made virtue inhuman, democracy therefore only relates to the present by the lessons of experience that descend from it. Even in a popular government, the power ought not to fall into the hands of the common people. 2.2. Monarchy. With monarchy and despotism, which is in some sense its inverse and pole of attraction, we are in the present. Montesquieu thinks that modern times belong to feudal monarchy, and the feudal monarchy belongs to modern times. Antiquity knew no real monarchies. In Rome, as we know, the republic was what was hidden in its trappings, for two reasons, which their conjunction will illuminate: because it was ignorant of the true distribution of powers and knew nothing of government by the nobility. What is monarchy? By its nature it is the government of a single person who directs the state by fixed and established laws. By its principle, it is the reign of honor. A single person who governs, the king. But what are these laws? Montesquieu, Politics and History 65-66, which have the privilege of being fixed and established. What is the meaning of this fixity and establishment? Here Montesquieu has in mind what jurists had for 3 centuries called the fundamental laws of the kingdom. The expression fundamental law often appears in the spirit of laws. Every government has its fundamental laws. Thus the Republic has, among others, the electoral law. Thus despotism has the nomination of a vizier by the despot. We even learn in passing that the colonial pact is the fundamental law of Europe vis-à-vis its overseas colonial possessions. Thus Montesquieu uses the expression in a very broad way, assigning to it the designation of those laws in a government that define and found its nature, in modern terms, its constitution, as distinct from the laws by which the government governs. But it is obvious that in the case of a monarchy this expression contains the echoes of past disputes. The object of these disputes was the definition of the powers of the absolute monarch. The notion of the fundamental laws of the kingdom intervened to limit the pretensions of the king. It demonstrated to him that he was king, by the grace of God no doubt, but also as an effect of laws older than him which he accepted tacitly by mounting the throne, the virtue of these laws seating him there even unbeknownst to him. The jurists usually cited the law of blood succession, but also a whole series of dispositions whose object was the recognition of the existing orders, nobility, clergy, parliament, etc. The fundamental laws which set the king on his throne demanded in return that the king respect them. It is to this meaning that Montesquieu is reverting under cover of a more general sense, when he talks of monarchy. Read carefully Book 11 Chapter 4. You will find that the first sentence identifies the nature of monarchical government, government by fundamental laws, and the intermediate, subordinate, and dependent powers. The intermediary powers are two in number, the nobility and the clergy, the nobility being the most natural of the two. Those intermediary bodies are to be laws. Elsewhere Montesquieu cites as a fundamental law of monarchy the law of succession to the throne, which prevents intrigue on Montesquieu, Politics and History 67. The dissipation of power, not only on the death, but also during the youth of a prince. This law really is a law. He also invokes the necessity of a depository of the laws independent of the royal authority, and this really is a matter of a law establishing a political institution. But the nobility and the clergy. We were thinking of political institutions, and here we have the intervention of social orders. In fact, the word lamb here only designates the privileged bodies in order to signify that the king is only the king through the existence of the nobility and the clergy, and that in return he must recognize them and defend their privileges. This is all admitted straight away. The most natural intermediate and subordinate power is that of the nobility. This, in some measure, seems to be essential to a monarchy, whose fundamental maxim is no monarch, no nobility, no nobility, no monarch. I think that we can learn a great deal here from the abstract character of at least a part of Montesquieu's political typology. There is no longer any reason to wait for the principle to discover the concrete life of the state. The whole political and social order emerges already in its nature. These fundamental laws necessarily suppose the intermediate channels through which the power flows. These channels are precisely the nobility and the clergy. But by a linguistic trick we are again facing a purely legal problem. These laws necessarily appear, is thus really worth its weight in gold. For until now the necessity for the nobility and the clergy has not been at all obvious. It is by no means a primordial necessity. It is a necessity in the sense in which we speak of the necessity one is in to accept a certain means supposing one wants a particular end. This necessity consists in the fact that in the absence of intermediate orders there is nothing to prevent the king being a despot. For, in monarchies, the prince is the source of all power, political and civil, but if there be only the momentary and capricious will of a single person to govern the state, nothing can be fixed, and of course there is no fundamental law. Everything is in these four uns. The fundamental law is the fixity and constancy of a regime. You write. We are in 68 the legal field. But it is also the existence of privileged orders. Now we are in the social field. It follows from this reasoning that these orders are identical with the fixity and constancy. The reason for this remarkable identity is that a monarch without a nobility and without orders is not inconceivable, but he would be despotic. The performance of the mechanics of power, the channels, serves the cause of the orders and combats that of the despot which any prince is if he dispenses with the nobility. Hence we can conclude that in essentials, these fixed and established laws are no more than the fixity of the establishment of the nobility and the clergy. Given this, the juridical argument returns to the four. And Montesquieu is pleased to describe the dynamic peculiar to this regime of intermediary bodies as if it were a matter of a pure form of the political distribution of power. It is very remarkable that the metaphor that haunts despotism is taken from colliding bodies, while the one that haunts monarchy derives from a flowing spring. Water which flows from an elevated spring passes into channels which moderate its speed and guide its course, and at the bottom reaches the lands which owe it their verdure. The image of colliding balls implies immediacy in time and space, and the force entirely transmitted by the impact. That is why in despotism power is either exercised or handed over. The image of the irrigating spring implies, on the contrary, space and duration. Its temporality being its course, time is needed for the water to flow. And it never all flows away. A spring does not empty like a basin, it always contains more than it gives away. And contrary to the ball which may be ejected in the opposite direction to the one with which it collided, their instantaneous impact sharply separating them, flowing water never breaks with itself. It is the same uninterrupted stream, from the spring to the most distant lands. Such is the power of the prince. He never abdicates it, as the despot does, entirely into the hands of a third party. However much power he gives to ministers, governors and captains, he always retains more. And the world in which he exercises it, its Montesquieu, Politics and History 69 extent, the channels which he has to grant the loan of it, all impose on him a necessary slowness which is the very duration of his power. In fact, the nature of monarchical government presupposes a real space and duration. The space, the king does not fill it by himself, in it he meets a social structure which is extended because it is differentiated, composed of orders and estates, each having its place. The space which is the measure of the extent of the royal power is thus the limit of his authority. The space is an obstacle. The infinite plane of despotism is a kind of narrow horizon before the despot, precisely because it contains none of those accidents constituted by the inequalities of men. It has been leveled. It is the following obstacles, the nobility, the clergy, that give the space its political depth, just as the following obstacles, hedges, roofs and steeples give it its visual depth. And the time of the royal power is merely this space experienced. As a man endowed with the supreme power, the king is a prey to haste, everything seeming to be a matter of decree. He will learn the slowness of the very world he governs, of the privileged orders, and of that body entirely devoted to teaching it him in a good monarchy, the depository of the laws. This slowness will be a kind of enforced education of the sovereign's political reason by the real and full distance which separates him from his subjects. It is from this distance that he will acquire reason. This prince, who is certainly no angel, will become reasonable by the very necessity of his power. Its space and duration will be the practical reason of a king, forced to become wise by experience, if he is not so by birth. In a democracy the notables, by their rank and fortune, stand in for reason for the people. In the same way, in a monarchy, the nobility stands in for wisdom for the king. But there is one essential difference between democracy and monarchy. In a democracy it is absolutely necessary that there be virtue and reason somewhere, and that some men be reasonable of themselves who could not hope to be so despite themselves. It is impossible for a republic to be democratic if its notables are not virtuous. The fate of reason is thus handed over to men themselves, even if it is only delegated to a few of them. It is quite 70 different in a monarchy. The nobility that stands in for wisdom for the king is not forced to be wise. On the contrary, it is its nature to be unreasonable. It is incapable of reflection, so much so that it has to look to lawyers to remember the laws it does not want to forget. Whence then does monarchy, in which nothing is reasonable, derive this reason? From the nobility, which does not have any, but produces it without wishing it or realizing it, without even having anything to do with it. It is thus just as if monarchy produced political reason as the result of its private unreasons. This reason, which features under none of the rubrics, is there nonetheless in the whole. It is surely the most profound law of monarchy that it produces its end despite itself in this way. If its fundamental laws need to be complemented by one last one, which is really the first, it would be to state that the original law of monarchy is this reason. This is what constitutes the very essence of honor, the principle of monarchy. Indeed, the truth of honor lies in the fact that it is false. Philosophically speaking, it is a false honor, says Montesquieu. This falsity has to be understood in two senses. First, that the truth of honor has nothing to do with the truth. Second, that this lie produces a truth in its own despite. Honor has nothing to do with truth, nor with morality. This seems to clash with all the appearances of honor itself, since honor means frankness, obedience, politeness and generosity. Frankness? For honor, truth. In conversation, is here a necessary point. But is it for the sake of truth? By no means. Such a love of truth and simplicity is to be found in the people, who have no part in honor, but not in honor, which is only interested in truth because a person habituated to veracity has an air of boldness and freedom. Obedience? Honor does not accept it for obedience's sake, but for honor's sake, not for the goodness or virtue of submission, but for the grandeur restored to it by the choice it makes to submit. The proof is that this entirely submissive honor subjects the status of the commands it receives to its own judgment, disobeying all those it reckons dishonorable, all those that conflict with its own laws. Montesquieu, Politics and History 7/End Codes. Politeness and generosity, greatness of soul. These are indeed obligatory duties for all men towards their kind if they are to live together in peace. But in honor, politeness, generally speaking, does not derive its original from so pure a source. It rises from a desire of distinguishing ourselves. It is pride that renders us polite. We are flattered with being taken notice of for a behavior that shows we are not of a mean condition, and that we have not been bred up with those who in all ages are considered as the scum of the people. Generosity itself, which seems to flow from goodness, is merely the proof that a well-born soul wants to present itself as greater than its fortune, by giving it away, and above its rank, by forgetting it, as if it could deny the advantage of rank that is required to have the pleasure of denying it. All the appearances of virtue have thus been turned upside down, for honor is not so much the subject of virtue as its subjugator. To this whimsical honor it is owing that the virtues are only just what it pleases. It adds rules of its own invention to everything prescribed to us. It extends or limits our duties according to its own fancy, whether they proceed from religion, politics, or morality. Does honor then have some relation with a different truth that is no longer theoretical or moral, but quite practical and profane? It looks like it when we find Montesquieu seeking in the barbarous laws, which subordinated the judge's decision to trial by combat, for the origin of honor and the point of honor. This recalls Hobbes and his extraordinary image of the destiny of men in struggle. In the endless race which constitutes our whole life, we are on a kind of track in which we all started together. Until death, which is to abandon the race, we continue to struggle, endlessly trying to pass one another. Honor is then to turn round and see that there are people behind us. That is Hobbes's honor, which expresses both the human wish to take advantage of man and the real and conscious merit of having improved on men. But it is not Montesquieu's honor. For him, honor is not the spring of the human condition, the universal passion which arouses the universal struggle for prestige and recognition, in which 7-2 Hegel was to see the origin of the master and the slave, and of self-consciousness. In Montesquieu, the masters and slaves always pre-exist honor. Its triumph never celebrates a real triumph. The race was run before the starter's flag. In honor, if we must still speak of a race, some have 20 years' start, as Pascal puts it, and all the races in the procedure. This is because in fact if honor does demand honors and distinctions, it presupposes their sanctioned existence and their regular attribution. In other words, it presupposes a state in which preeminences and ranks prevail. Honor is the point of honor not of a merit attained in the struggle, but of a superiority obtained by birth. Honor is thus the passion of a social class. If it seems to be its father, since it was constituted in the distant origin of barbarous laws, when the Franks defeated the Gauls, its father, since it maintains it in the conviction of its superiority, honor is rather the child of the nobility, since outside the existence of the nobility it would be inconceivable. and all its falsity consists in the fact that it gives the appearance of morality or merit to reasons which pertain to the vanity of a class. But honor is false, not only because of its ruse with truth. It is false because this lie produces a truth. This strange passion, in fact so regulated that its whimsicalities have their laws and a whole code which seems to invert the social order by its contempt for order and society, serves the reason of the state by its very unreason. For honor, with its ruse of truth and morality, is itself the dupe of its own ruse. It thinks it knows no other duty than the duty one recognizes for oneself, the duty to distinguish oneself, to perpetuate one's own grandeur, to care for a certain self-image that raises one above one's own life, and the orders one receives. In fact, each individual advances the public good, while he only thinks of promoting his own interest. In fact, this false honor is as useful to the public as a true honor could possibly be to private people. Ibid. The virtues, false in their cause, are true in their effects: obedience, frankness, politeness and generosity. What does it matter to the prince whether he obtains them from morality and truth, or from vanity? Montesquieu, Politics and History 73 and Prejudice? Their effect is the same, and without the superhuman effort required of virtue in the same cause. Honor is the economy of virtue. It dispenses with it and gives the same effects at a lower cost. But there is a quite different merit, one which is of concern precisely to the prince who keeps the accounts and takes the profits. It will not let itself be beaten by anything, not even by the prestige of the supreme power. That it is above any laws, not just religious and moral ones, but also political ones, means that honor is the rock against the king's fancies. If the power of honor is limited by its very spring, if the great only ever have honor on their minds, this sufficiency suffices them. They have no other ambition at heart, whether of fortunes to be won or of power to be conquered. If honor is this blinding of the great to the real interests of the world, if its folly thus protects the prince from their audacity as the great, this folly also protects the prince against his own temptations as a man. For he can never hope that these great ones will ever enter into his plans for other reasons than their own, for motives foreign to this strange honor. He may lay claim to their complete service, but never their entire soul. And if he tries to go beyond reason and throw himself into enterprises which exceed the legitimate power, he will be held back by the honor of his nobles, which will oppose his laws to his orders and make the latter rebels. That is how reason will reign in the state, as the powerlessness of two follies, and truth, as two contradictory falsities. We can tell from this trait whether honor does not as the principle in this government play the same part as the nobility and the intermediary bodies do as the nature. And whether honor, far from being a general passion, as virtue must be in a republic, is not the passion of an estate, which may be contagious, as examples always are, but cannot be shared. Hidden away in a chapter on penal law we can read a short sentence to the effect that the peasant has no honor to lose, which makes him worthy to suffer bodily the punishments for his crimes. A great man is tortured in his honor, which is his soul. Shame thus taking the place of the weal. 7. For such is monarchy. A prince protected from his own excesses by privileged orders. orders protected from the prince by their honor. A prince protected from the people and a people protected from the prince by these same orders. Everything depending on the nobility. A power moderated less by its pure essence or its attribution than by the fixed and established social conditions in which it is exercised, and which, as obstacle and means, give it the slowness and conciliation which are its entire rationale. Each individual pulling for himself, having his own absolute in his head, and the equilibrium emerging, as if unbeknownst to all, from these very contradictory excesses. The reason of monarchy may well be described as a contrariety of follies. And as it is clear that this order is the one Montesquieu prefers, its structure may cast light on certain of his choices, and especially the ideas he has of men and reason. For if he does possess a true enthusiasm for intelligent reason, he has no passion for ideal reason. Montesquieu occasionally says that the reasonable is not all of reason, and that to do well is not to do good. If he holds republican virtue so high, it is because he believes that it is always more or less angelic and out of human reach. If he prefers to it the conciliation of monarchy and honor, it is indeed because honor, in its roundabout way, is the shortcut to virtue, but above all because this shortcut is made via passion's balm from the nature of a condition and not by the asceticism of a conversion. This reason he dreams of making supreme in the state is far rather the reason which acts behind men's backs and on them than the reason that lives in their consciousness, and by which they live. It is clear how monarchy naturally enters into that great law of history, already discovered, that it is not the consciousness of men that makes history. But it is also clear how such a general idea can serve such a particular cause. For of all the political unconsciousnesses, it is no mystery to say that Montesquieu knew how to choose the right one, monarchy. Montesquieu, Politics and History 75-3. Despot is M. In the order of Montesquieu's definitions, despotism is the last of the governments. I hope to show that it is the first in his mind. Not according to his preference, which obviously goes to monarchy, but, what comes to the same thing, in his aversion. And that his object is to provide new arguments not only for choosing monarchy, but also for re-establishing it on its true foundations, by counterposing to it the spectacle of its downfall and bugbear. What is despotism? Unlike the republic and like monarchy, it is an existing government. It is the government of the Turks, of the Persians, of Japan, of China and of most Asian countries. The government of immense countries with a voracious climate. The location of the despotic regimes already suggests their excess. Despotism is the government of extreme lands, of extreme extents beneath the most hardened skies. It is the limit government, and already the limit of government. It is easy to guess that the example of real countries is only providing Montesquieu with a pretext. Apparently, at the time of the 1948 conference, Turkish listeners, on mention of the famous statement that despotism is the government of the Turks, uttered the most lively and most justifiable of protestations. 3 M. Prelot has gravely related this incident. But without being a Turk, one can suspect the political exoticism of a man who never went beyond Venice and the frontiers of Austria, and only knew the Orient by accounts among which he knew precisely the ones to choose. By 1778, in an admirable work on legislation orientale, Althusser Ch4 was already opposing the realiste to Montesquieu's Oriental myth. But once the geographical myth of despotism has been denounced, there remains an idea of despotism that no Turkish protestation can refute. If the Persian does not exist, where does a French gentilhomme, born under Louis Ch4, get the idea of him? 3. Imprilat, Montesquieu et les formes de gouvernement, in Récit du bicentenaire de Vespert de Lois, p. 127. 76. Despotism is certainly a political idea, the idea of absolute evil, the idea of the very limits of politics as such. It is in fact insufficient to define despotism as the government in which a single person, with neither rules nor laws, directs everything by his own will and caprice. For this definition remains a superficial one so long as the concrete life of such a regime has not been represented. How indeed could a single person really direct by his own caprice the immense empire of lands and peoples subject to his decree? This is the paradox that must be illuminated to discover the meaning of the idea. The first feature of despotism is the fact that it is a political regime which has, so to speak, no structure. Neither legal, political nor social. Montesquieu repeats several times that despotism has no lamb, and by that we should understand first of all no fundamental laws. I know that Montesquieu cites one when he argues that the tyrant delegates all his power to the Grand Vizier, but this only has the appearance of a political law. In fact, it is simply a law of passion, a psychological law which betrays the bestiality of the tyrant and the divine surprise which reveals to him, in the depths of his laziness, like the Pope Montesquieu cites who resigned the administration of his states to his nephew, Ibid, that the government of men is the art of a child, it is enough to let a third party govern them. In its pretension, this false law, which illegitimately converts passion into politics, suggests that in despotism all politics can always be reduced entirely to passion. We still have no structure. I know that there is nonetheless in despotism a substitute for a fundamental law, religion. It is indeed the only authority which is above authority, and can, in some circumstances, moderate the excesses of the prince's cruelty and the subject's fear. But its essence, too, is passionate, since in despotism religion is itself despotic, it is fear added to fear. Hence neither in the Vizier nor in religion is there anything like an order of political and legal conditions transcending human passions. And in fact despotism knows no laws of succession. Nothing that designates tomorrow's despot to yesterday's Montesquieu, Politics and History 77 subjects. Not even the arbitrary decree of the despot, which can be reduced to nothing by a palace revolution, a harem conspiracy or a popular rising. Nor does it know political laws other than the one that governs the strange transmission of power, always absolute, which descends from the prince to the last family head in the land, via the first vizier, the governors, the bashaws, repeating imperturbably from one end of the kingdom to the other the logic of passion, laziness on the one hand, delight in domination on the other. Nor does it know any judiciary laws. The only code of the Cadi is his humor, the only procedure, his impatience. Hardly has he lent his ear to the parties than he decides, and distributes bastinadoes or chops off heads on the spot. Lastly, this strange regime does not even bother with that minimum of police that might regulate exchange and commerce. The society of needs is not even governed by the unconscious laws which constitute a market, an economic order transcending the practical life of men. No, the logic of the economy is the economy of logic. It reduces itself to the pure passions of men. The merchant himself lives from one day to the next for fear of losing tomorrow whatever surplus he might amass today, in his own way, like the American savage cited by Rousseau, who in the morning sells the bed he has just left, not thinking that there will be another night this evening. Without political or legal transcendence, i.e. without past or future, despotism is the regime of the moment. This precariousness is, if I may say so, ensured by the disappearance of any social structure. In a democracy, the magistrates have a statute, and property and even relative wealth are guaranteed by the law. In a monarchy, the nobility and the clergy are protected by the recognition of their privileges. In a despotism, nothing distinguishes between men. It is the realm of extreme equality which lowers all subjects to the same uniformity. Here, says Montesquieu, all men are equal, not because they are everything, as in a democracy, but because they are nothing. It is the suppression of orders by a general leveling down, no hereditary order, no nobility. This sanguinary regime cannot tolerate greatness and blood, nor greatness and goods. The 78 tyrant cannot suffer the continuity of families that time enriches and the succession and effort of generations elevate in human society. Better, he cannot tolerate any of the greatnesses of establishment that he himself confers on certain of his subjects. For ultimately a vizier, governors, bashaws and cadis are needed. But this greatness is only occasional, taken back the moment it is conceded, almost evanescent. It is nothing the moment it has arrived. Every clerk may thus hold all the power of the despot, but his life is a postponed disgrace or assassination. That is all his freedom, that is all his security. It is as easy, says Montesquieu, to make of a prince a scullion, and of a scullion a prince. The social distinctions that emerge from this egalitarian desert are no more than the appearance of a universal distinction. But even that body, so necessary to order or terror, the army, has no place in this regime. It would constitute too stable a body, and be too dangerous to the general instability. At most all that is needed is a guard of janissaries attached to the person of the prince, and which he sends out in lightning raids on someone's head, before locking it back up again in the night of the palace. Nothing that distinguishes between men, nothing that resembles in the slightest the outline of a social hierarchy or a social career, the organization of a social world, in which, in advance of and for all the time of the existence and for the growth of the generations, avenues open into the future, in which one may be sure of being noble for life if one is so by birth, of becoming bourgeois in life if one has deserved it by one's industry. No more than it knows any political and legal structure and transcendence, does despotism know any social structure. This disposition gives a strange pace to the life of this regime. This government which reigns over vast spaces in some sense lacks any social space. This regime, which has lasted millennia in the Chinese example, is somehow stripped of all duration. Its social space and its political time are neutral and uniform. Space without places, time without duration. Kings, says Montesquieu, know the differences there are between provinces, and respect them. Despots not only do not know such differences, they Montesquieu, Politics and History 79 destroy them. They reign only over empty uniformity, over the void constituted by the uncertainty of tomorrow, abandoned lands and a commerce that expires at its birth, over deserts. And it is the desert itself that despotism establishes at its frontiers, burning lands, even its own, to isolate itself from the world, to protect itself from the contagions and invasions from which nothing else can save it. In fact, nothing that resists in the void, let a foreign army penetrate into the empire and nothing will stop it, neither strong point nor force, since there are none. It is thus necessary to weaken it before it ever reaches the frontier by opposing it with a first desert in which it will perish. The space of despotism is no more than the void. Thinking he is governing an empire, the despot reigns only over a desert. As for the time of despotism, it is the opposite of duration, the moment. Not only does despotism know no institutions, no orders and no families that last, but also its very own acts spurt out in a moment. The entire people is made in the image of the despot. The despot decides in a moment. Without reflecting, without comparing reasons, without weighing arguments, without mediums or limitations. For it takes time to reflect, and a certain idea of the future. But the despot has no more idea of the future than the merchant who profits in order to eat, and that is all. All his reflection comes down to deciding, and the legion of his precarious administrators repeat the same blind gesture to the end of the most remote province. What could they decide anyway? They are like judges without codes. They do not know the tyrant's reasons, he has none anyway. They have to decide. Hence they will follow his subcutaneous manner of willing. As subcutaneously as they will be disgraced or butchered, sharing in every respect the condition of their master, who would only learn of his future from his death, if he were not dying. This logic of abstract immediacy, which contains extraordinary inklings of some of Hegel's critical themes, does nonetheless have a certain truth and content. For this regime that survives, so to speak, beneath the political and the social, restricted to the step below their generality and constancy, does at least live the lower life of this step. And this life is solely the life of immediate passion. Perhaps it has not been sufficiently realized that the famous passions that constitute the principles of the different governments are not all of the same essence. Honor, for example, is not a simple passion, or, if you prefer, is not a psychological passion. Honor is capricious like all passions, but its caprices are regulated, it has its laws and its code. It would not require much pressure to make Montesquieu admit that the essence of monarchy is a disobedience, but a regulated disobedience. Honor is thus a reflected passion, even in its own intransigence. However psychological, however immediate, honor is a passion highly educated by society, a cultivated passion, and, if the term can be suggested, a cultural and social passion. The same is true of the passion of the Republic. It, too, is a strange passion, one which has nothing immediate about it but sacrifices in man his own wishes to give him the general good as his object. Virtue is defined as the passion for the general. And Montesquieu obligingly shows us certain monks shifting to the generality of their order all the ardor of the particular passions they repress in themselves. Like honor, virtue thus has its code and its laws. Or rather it has its law, a single law, love of the fatherland. This passion for universality demands a universal education, the school of all life itself. Montesquieu answered the old Socratic question, can virtue educate itself, by saying, it must, and the whole destiny of virtue is precisely to be taught. The passion that sustains despotism knows not this duty. Fear, for since it must be called by its name, needs no education, and the latter is, in despotism, in some measure, needless. It is not a compound or educated passion, nor a social passion. It knows neither codes nor laws. It is a passion without a career before it, and with no title behind it, a passion in statu nascendi which nothing will ever divert from its birth. A momentary for. It is very remarkable that Montesquieu reserves fear, which Hobbes, the theorist of absolutism, found at the heart of all societies, to despotism alone. Montesquieu, Politics and History 81 passion which only ever repeats itself. Among the political passions it is the only one which is not political, but psychological, because immediate. Nonetheless, this is the passion that constitutes the life of this strange regime. If a tyrant resigns the exercise of government out of laziness and boredom, that is because he refuses to be a public man. It is because he does not want to pretend to that order of considered impersonality which constitutes a statesman. By a movement of private whim or lassitude, which dresses up in the trappings of solemnity, he divests himself of the public personage and hands it over to a third party, as a king hands his cloak to a valet, in order to abandon himself to the delights of private passions. The despot is no more than his desires. Hence the harem. This abdication of the despot is the general form of the regime that renounces the order of the political in order to give itself up to the destiny of the passions alone. It is hardly surprising therefore to see the same pattern repeated indefinitely in all the men making up the empire. The lowliest subject is a despot, at least over his wives, but also their prisoner, the prisoner of his passions. When he leaves his house, it is his desires that move him once more. This shows that in a despotism, the only desire that survives is a desire for the conveniences of life. 6 But this is not a desire followed through, it does not have the time to compose itself a future. Thus the passions of despotism overturn into one another. The spring of despotism could be said to be desire as much as fear. For they are for themselves their own inverses, without any future, like two men tied back to back with no space between them, riveted to the spot by their chains. And it is this model of passion that gives despotism its style. That absence of duration, those sudden, Irretrievable movements are precisely the attributes of these momentary and immediate passions which fall back on themselves like stones children hope to throw to heaven. If it is true, as Marx said in A Youthful Image, that politics is the heaven of private men, despotism can be described as a world without a heaven. 5. SL. V. 17 and 18, VU, 4. Cf. 9, 6. Despotism is the reign of private interest. And it is only too clear that what Montesquieu has been trying to represent in this picture of despotism is something quite different from the state in Oriental regimes. It is the abdication of politics itself. This value judgment explains its paradoxical character. In fact, despotism is always on the brink of being considered as a regime which does not exist but is the temptation and peril of the other regimes when corrupted, and yet as a regime which does exist, and can even be corrupted. Although corrupt in essence, it can never fall into anything but corruption itself. No doubt that is the fate of all reprobate extremes. It is convenient to represent them as real in order to inspire disgust. It takes many pictures of the devil to uphold virtue. But it is also important to give the extremity all the features of the impossible and of negativity, to show that it is not what it claims, and to destroy in it even the appearances of the good that would be lost if one lapsed into it. That is why the image of despotism is justified by the example of the regimes of the East, at a time when the latter impressed itself and was refuted as an idea. Let us therefore leave the Turks and the Chinese in peace, and focus on the positive image for which this danger is the bugbear. We have a sufficient number of texts and sufficiently categorical ones by Montesquieu and his contemporaries to suggest that despotism is only a geographical illusion because it is a historical illusion. It is absolute monarchy that is Montesquieu's target, or if not absolute monarchy in person, then at least the temptations to which it is prone. 6. As is well known, Montesquieu belonged by conviction to that right-wing oppositional party of feudal extraction which did not accept the political decline of its class and attacked the new political forms inaugurated since the 14th century for having supplanted the older ones. Fenelon, Boulainvilliers and Saint-Simon were of this party, which, until his death, set all its hopes on the Duc de Bourgogne, whom 6. Cf. The 37th Persian letter, a portrait of Louis XIV. Uzbek, he hath often been heard to say, that of all the governments in the world, that of the Turks, or of our august Sultan, pleased him best, so highly does he esteem the politics of the East. Montesquieu, Politics and History 83. Montesquieu made his hero. 7. It is to this party that we owe the most famous of the dolences against the excesses of Louis XI's reign. The poverty of the peasantry, the horrors of war, the intrigues and usurpations of courtesans, these are the themes of its denunciations. All these famous texts acquired liberal overtones by their oppositional character, and I am afraid that they often feature in anthologies of La Liberté alongside those of Montesquieu himself, and not without a well-established appearance of correctness, for this opposition took a unique part in the struggle against the feudal power really, and whatever they may have said, embodied by the absolute monarchy. But the purposes which inspired them had about as much relation to liberty as the ultras' clamor against capitalist society under the Restoration and the July monarchy had with socialism. In denouncing despotism, Montesquieu is not defending against the politics of absolutism so much liberty in general as the particular liberties of the feudal class, its individual security, the conditions of its lasting survival and its pretensions to return in new organs of power to the place which had been robbed from it by history. No doubt despotism is a caricature, but its object is to terrify and to edify by its very horribleness. Here is a regime in which a single individual governs, in a palace he never leaves, prey to feminine passions and the intrigues of courtesans. A caricature of Versailles and the court. Here is a tyrant who governs through his grand vizier. A caricature of the magistrate whom nothing, above all not his birth, entitles to that post save the prince's 7. The death of the last dauphin was a dreadful wound for the kingdom. Although all the diverse plans for his government were unknown, it is still certain that he had the grandest ideas in the world. It is certain that there was nothing in the world he hated so much as despotism. He wanted to restore all the various provinces of the kingdom their estates, like Breton and Languedoc. He proposed that there should be councils and that state secretaries should only be the secretaries of these councils. He proposed to reduce the costs of office, charges de la robe, to the necessary level. He proposed that the king have a kind of civil list as in England, for the upkeep of his house and court, and that in time of war this civil list should be taxed like other funds, for, he said, it is unjust that all the subjects should suffer from the war without the prince suffering too. He proposed that his court should have some morals. 8. The two worst reticents France has known, Richelieu and Louis. 84 favor. And even in the all-powerful governor's dispatch to the provinces, can we fail to recognize the grotesque masks of the intendants charged with the king's omnipotence in their domains? How could we fail to suspect in the regime of caprice a forced caricature of the regime of bon plaisir, and the tyrant who was touted at without saying it, a distorted echo of the prince who had already said it, even if it was not yet completely true, but a cause has to be judged by its effects. Once we see the respective situations of the great and the people in despotism, we will realize the dangers against which it was meant to be a forewarning. The paradox of despotism is to make such an effective attack on the great, whatever their extraction, and how could we fail to think of the nobility, the least irrevocable of the great? 9. That the people are in some sense spared. The despot has so much to do to defeat the great and destroy the threat of the rebirth of their condition, that the people, who know nothing of such things, are sheltered from this struggle unleashed over their heads. In a certain sense, despotism is the great brought down and the people tranquil in their passions and affairs. Sometimes, says Montesquieu, one sees torrents swollen by storms descend the mountain, ravaging all in their paths. But all around there are only green fields and grazing flocks. In the same way, despots sweep away the great, while the people, though poverty-stricken, know a kind of peace. I admit that this is only a tranquility and indeed the tranquility that reigns in a besieged town, since it is in these terms that Montesquieu criticizes it, but who would not prefer it to the terror of the great, who live in the pallor of expected blows, if not death? When we come upon these passages, which Montesquieu almost seems to let slip, it is clear that inadvertence has nothing to do with it. It is in fact a warning which has also the meaning of a reminder. The lesson is clear: the great have everything to fear from despotism, from terror to destruction. The people, however miserable they may be, are protected. 9. As the instability of the great is natural to a despotic government, so their security is interwoven with the nature of monarchy. Montesquieu, Politics and History. $8 protected, but also just as threatening in their own way. For despotism presents a second privilege, that it is the regime of popular revolution. 10. No other government leaves the people to their passions alone, and God knows, the people are subject to them. These popular passions need the bridle of reflection. The notables elected in a republic, the intermediary bodies found in a monarchy. But in a despotism, in which passion reigns supreme, how are the people's instincts to be chained, in the absence of any order, legal or social, which they will accept? When passions dominate, the people, who are passion, always win in the end, even if only for a day. But this day is enough to destroy everything. Enough at any rate to overthrow the tyrant in the shocks of a revolution. All this is plain to read in Book V, Chapter N of the Spirit of Laws. 11. And it is hard to avoid drawing the second lesson, this time not addressed to the great, but to the tyrants, or by extension to those modern monarchs tempted by despotism. This second lesson clearly signifies, despotism is the sure road to popular revolutions. Princes, avoid despotism if you would save your thrones from the people's violence. 10. SL. V. 11. Cf. Vi. 2. In a despotism everything leads to sudden and unforeseen revolutions. 11. SL. V. II. Monarchy has a great advantage over a despotic government, as it naturally requires there should be several orders or ranks of subjects. The state is more permanent, the constitution more steady, and the person of him who governs more secure. Cicero is of the opinion that the establishing of the tribunes preserved the republic. And, indeed, says he, the violence of a heedless people is more terrible. A chief, or head, is sensible that the affair depends upon himself, and therefore he thinks, but the people, in their impetuosity, are ignorant of the danger into which they hurry themselves. This reflection may be applied to a despotic government, which is a people without tribunes, and to a monarchy, where the people have some sort of tribunes. Accordingly, it is observable, that, in the commotions of a despotic government, the people, hurried away by their passions, are apt to push things as far as they can go. The disorders they commit are all extreme, whereas, in monarchies, matters are seldom carried to excess. The chiefs are apprehensive on their own account, they are afraid of being abandoned, and the intermediate dependent powers do not choose that the populace should have too much the upper hand. Thus all our histories are full of civil wars without revolutions, while the histories of despotic governments abound with revolutions without civil wars. Monarchs, who live under the fundamental laws of their country, are far happier than despotic princes, who have nothing to regulate either their own passions or those of their subjects. 86. These two lessons together constitute a third. If the prince ruthlessly fights the great will thereby lose their conditions of existence. But in doing so, the prince will have cleared the way for the people, who will turn against him, and nothing now protects him from their blows. He will thereby lose his crown and his youth. Hence let the prince understand that he needs the rampart provided by the great to defend his crown and his life against the people. That is the basis for a fine and completely reasonable alliance based on mutual advantage. All he has to do to secure his throne is to recognize the nobility. Such is despotism. An existing regime, certainly, but also and above all an existing threat which hangs over the other regime of the present day, monarchy. An existing regime, certainly, but also and above all a political lesson, a clear warning to a king tempted by absolute power. It is clear that despite its apparent detachment, the original list conceals a secret choice. Maybe there are 3 species of government. But one, the Republic, does not exist except in historical memory. We are left with monarchy and despotism. But despotism is no more than abusive, perverted monarchy. We are thus left with monarchy alone, a monarchy to be protected from its perils. So much for the present period. But, it will be said, what of the future? And what about the English Constitution which Montesquieu presents as an ideal in the famous 6th chapter of Book 11? Is it not a new model, superseding all the earlier lessons? I hope to prove that it is nothing of the kind, and that the logic of the theory of monarchy and despotism constitutes if not all the meanings, at least one important one, of the famous debate about the separation of powers. Chapter 5 The Myth of the Separation of Powers. This is a famous text. Who is not familiar with the theory according to which every good government rigorously distinguishes between the legislature, the executive and the judiciary? That it guarantees the independence of each of these powers in order to obtain from this separation the advantages of moderation, security and liberty? Such, according to this theory, is in fact the secret of Book XI, conceived later than the first 10, and inspired in Montesquieu by the revelation of England, where, during a stay in 1729–30, he discovered a radically new regime with no other object than liberty. Before Book 11, Montesquieu presented a classical theory, distinguishing different political forms, describing their peculiar economies and dynamics. He then threw off the mask of the dispassionate historian, and even, if it is to be believed, that of the partisan gentilhomme, to give the public the ideal of a nation with 2 chambers, an assembly of the third estate, and elected judges. Thereby, for some, Montesquieu at last reached the sphere of the political as such, and demonstrated his genius in a theory of the balance of the powers, so well arranged that power is itself the limit of power, thus resolving once and for all the political problem, which is entirely a matter of the use and abuse of power. For others, the political problems of the future greater than L, which are less those of monarchy in general than those of representative and parliamentary government. The temporal succession is in some sense the guarantee of this interpretation. Did not the age as a whole look to Montesquieu for arguments to weaken I? Prelate, Op. Cit. Pages 123, I-29 FLF. 8.8 The monarchical order, to justify parliaments, and even for the convocation of the Estates General? Did not the American Constitution of the end of the century and the French Constitution of 1791 itself, not to speak of those of 1795 and 1848, consecrate Montesquieu's desired principles of the separation of powers in their arguments and dispositions? These two themes, the separation of powers, the balance of powers, are they not still current themes, still taken up and disputed in the very words established by Montesquieu? I hope to be able to argue that this is almost completely a historical illusion, and give reasons for it. In this vein, I should first like to make explicit all the articles of the jurist Charles Eisenman. I should like to repeat the essential points of these articles here before extending their conclusions. Eisenman's thesis is that Montesquieu's theory, and in particular the famous chapter on the Constitution of England, has produced a real myth, the myth of the separation of powers. A whole school of jurists arose, particularly at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, which took advantage of a number of isolated formulations of Montesquieu's in order to impose on him a purely imaginary theoretical model. According to this model, Montesquieu's political ideal coincides with a regime in which this separation of powers is rigorously guaranteed. There should be three powers: the executive, the king, his ministers, the legislature, the lower and upper chambers, and the judiciary, the body of magistrates. Each power corresponds precisely to its own sphere, i.e. its own function, without any interference. Each power in each sphere is provided for by an organ rigorously distinct from the other organs. Not only can there be no encroachment of the executive onto the legislature or judiciary, or any reciprocal encroachment of the same kind, but also none of the parts constituting an organ can belong to any other organ. For example, not only can the executive not inter two. See in particular, Eisenman, L'esprit de l'os et la séparation des pouvoirs, Mélanges Carré de Malberg, Paris 1933, pp 163-92, La Pensée constitutionnelle de Montesquieu, Recueil Syrie, Op. See it, pages 133-60. Montesquieu, Politics and History 8 Grands Venet in the legislature by proposing laws or in the judiciary by pressure, etc. Not only can no minister be responsible to the legislature, but also no member of the legislature can, in his personal capacity, assume executive and judicial functions, i.e. become a minister or a magistrate, etc. I leave aside the details of this logic, which is still alive in some people's minds. Eisenman's first audacity was to show that this famous theory quite simply does not exist in Montesquieu. A careful reading of his text shows, in fact, 1. That the executive encroaches on the legislature, since the king has the power of veto. 2. That the legislature can to a certain extent exercise a right of inspection over the executive, since it checks on the application of the laws it has voted, and, without there being any question of ministerial responsibility to Parliament, can ask for accounts from the ministers. 3-4-56-3. That the legislature encroaches seriously on the judiciary, since, in three special circumstances, it sets itself up as a tribunal, in all matters, the nobles, whose dignity must be preserved from any contact with the prejudices of popular magistrates, will be judged by their peers in the upper chamber. Registered in questions of amnesty, and in questions of political trials, which are brought before the tribunal of the upper chamber on the impeachment of the lower chamber. 7.3. The executive power has no other part in the legislative than the power of rejecting. 4. The legislative power has a right, and ought to have the means, of examining in what manner its laws have been executed. The ministers must give an account of their administration. 5. The great are always obnoxious to popular envy, and, were they to be judged by the people, they might be in danger from their judges, and would moreover be deprived of the privilege, which the meanest subject is possessed of in a free state, of being tried by his peers. The nobility, for this reason, ought not to be cited before the ordinary courts of the judicature, but before that part of the legislature which is compounded of their own body. 6. It is possible that the law might, in some cases, be too severe. That part of the legislative body, which we have just now observed to be a necessary tribunal on another occasion, is also a necessary tribunal in this: it belongs to its supreme authority to moderate the law in favor of the law itself. 7. It might also happen that a subject, entrusted with the administration of 9. It is hard to see how such important interferences of powers as these can be reconciled with the claimed purity of their separation. Eisenmann's second audacity was to show that in fact Montesquieu is not concerned about the separation, but about the combination, fusion and liaison of these powers. 8. The essential point of this proof consists first of being clear that the judicial power is not a power in the true sense of the word. This power is in some measure, next to nothing, says Montesquieu. 9. And in fact, for him the judge is only a sight and a voice. It is a man whose only function is to read and speak the law. 10. This interpretation is disputable, but it must at least be admitted that in matters where the judge threatened to be more than an animated code, Montesquieu was careful to enact guarantees which are no longer legal but political. For example, look who judges the crimes and deliriums of the nobles in political cases. Once taken, these precautions which transfer any political effects the judiciary may have to more strictly political organs ensure that the rest of the judiciary really is next to nothing. We then confront two powers, the executive and the legislature. Two pouvoirs but three puissances, to use Montesquieu's own words. 11. These three public affairs may infringe the rights of the people. In general, the legislative power cannot try causes, and much less can it try this particular case, where it represents the party aggrieved, which is the people. It can only, therefore, impeach. But before what court shall it bring its impeachment? Must it go and demean itself before the ordinary tribunals, which are its inferiors, and, being composed moreover of men who are chosen from the people as well as itself, will naturally be swayed by the authority of so powerful an accuser? In order to preserve the dignity of the people and the security of the subject, the legislative part which represents the people must bring in its charge before the legislative part which represents the nobility, who have neither the same interests nor the same passions. 8. The legislative body being composed of two parts, they check one another. They are both restrained by the executive power, as the executive is by the legislative. The three powers are: distributed and founded. 9. Of the three powers above mentioned, the judiciary is, in some sense, next to nothing. 10. The national judges are no more than the mouth that pronounces the words of the law, mere passive beings, incapable of moderating either its force or rigor. 11. Cf. The passage on Venice in SL, X1, 6, thus at Venice, the legislative power, pouvoir, is in the council, the executive in the pregati, and the judiciary in the quarantia. But the mischief is, that these different tribunals are composed of magas Montesquieu, politics and history. Gi puissances are the king, the upper chamber and the lower chamber, i.e. the king, the nobility and the people. Here Eisenman shows very convincingly that Montesquieu's true object is precisely the combination, the liaison of these three puissances. 12 That what is involved is above all a political problem of relations of forces, not a juridical problem concerning the definition of legality and its spheres. This casts light on the famous problem of moderate government. True moderation is neither the strict separation of powers, pouvoirs, nor a juridical concern and respect for legality. At Venice, for example, there are indeed three powers and three distinct organs, but the mischief is that these three organs are composed of magistrates all belonging to the same body, which constitutes almost one and the same puissance, SL 11, 6. Thus it is all very well to say that despotism is the regime in which a single person governs alone, without rules or laws, or that the despot appears in every prince or minister who goes beyond the law and abuses his power. At bottom, this is not what is at issue, for we are familiar with regimes in which despotism reigns even under the appearance of laws, and, says Montesquieu, that is the worst of tyrannies. 13 Moderation is something quite different. It is not mere respect for legality, it is the balance of powers, i.e. the division of the pouvoirs among the puissances, and the limitation or moderation of the pretensions of one puissance by the pouvoir of the others. The famous separation of powers is thus no more than the calculated division of pouvoir between determinate puissances, the king,